This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com, and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Hello, this is the Stephen Coughlin moment brought to you by the Glazov gang. The CV narrative was set within 1 month of 9/11. I'd like to run through a couple people, famous people, Sun Tzu, Louis Safi of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Society for Professional Journalists, a left-leaning organization, to make this argument. Before I start, I'd just like to run an idea through you. One is a constant theme as I discuss the CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism narrative, which is the dominant narrative we have adopted in this country to understand the war on terror. In 2003, Carlos the Jackal said, "Only a coalition of Marxists and Islamists can destroy the United States." One of the things that really imbues much of the work I do is a recognition that this is not just a statement of affinity, but an actual alliance in fact. So I would like to point out that one of the things we really need to know is as old as Sun Tzu, who wrote in The Art of War in 600 BC, the necessity of knowing the enemy. I want to quote him. "If you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but you do not know the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle." A consequence of that is if you do not know the enemy, you simply cannot have a strategy to defeat him. That should make sense. You cannot target what you do not know. And of course, Sun Tzu had something to say about that as well. You can have all the tactics you want in a war, and we've had many very successful tactics in this war on terror. But you know what he said, Sun Tzu? Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So why am I bringing this up? Because when I wrote my thesis back in 2007, I wanted to point out to people that the objective of the enemy in this war on terror is non-kinetic victory and subsequent economic dominance through subversion of the doctrinal template through systematic control of its inputs at all levels. Now I know some people are saying, what are you saying? So I'll put this in more easier language. The objective of the enemy was to win the war by controlling our decision-making, by controlling what decision makers think they know about the issues that support their decisions in the war on terror. For the enemy, that has been the objective. So as I told you, that the narrative was set, the hostile narrative was set on the war on terror within 1 month of 9/11. First we have from Louis Safi, who was at the time executive director of the IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought. He wrote a book that came out within a month called Peace in the Limits of War, Transcending Classical Conceptions of Jihad. And he wrote it under the IIIT nameplate. And what did he say in this book? Western scholars who accept jihad as holy war feed on the position of radical Muslim ideologues. Well, of course, that's right. And when I read that, I said, I'm an intelligence officer. My job is to validate the enemy's threat doctrine. So I started recognizing that I had to look at that. And what I found when I was saying this in the Pentagon, when I was one of those people who accepted jihad as holy war because it feeds on the position of what our radical enemies were saying, I was told, Steve, you can't say that because you're validating Al-Qaeda's narrative. And I would say, but that's what we're supposed to do in intelligence. We're supposed to validate their narrative. We're supposed to know the enemy. So Louis Safi went on in his book and he said, I, Louis Safi, executive director of the IIIT, a known Muslim Brotherhood front group, I intend to focus my discussion in this book on rebutting the propositions of the classical doctrine of jihad that is embraced by radical Muslims. So what did he also say in this book? He said that the radicals have adopted the classical understandings of jihad, which is to say that the Muslim Brotherhood was acknowledging that the jihad that the radicals were talking about were in fact accurate and actually discussing the real threat doctrines that come from Islamic law. So this is what the CVE banned. So here it is. I decided to understand the enemy as he understands himself. And by virtue of doing that, my seniors in the intelligence world said, you can't do that. You're validating what the enemy is saying. And my answer was, well, Yes, that's how you do threat analysis. And that's how you can target an enemy, by knowing who he is and what his doctrine is. And only then can you counter both his doctrines and his tactics. So you see what happened. Now, this would be the same Louis Safi who was teaching in places like Fort Hood in 2009. You know, the same Fort Hood where Major Hassan shot people up as a jihad. When he was teaching our troops at Fort Hood that same month, he taught something as silly as this. Who are Muslims? A Muslim is a Christian who practices the Jewish law. That's what we got from this. Now, so now we have it that we know Sun Tzu said we must know the enemy. We have Louis Safi saying this is who we are, and then creating this narrative that says that if you analyze that, you're validating the enemy, and you can't do that, and then demanding that our intelligence shut down. But the people who actually established that as a narrative ended up being a group called the Society of Professional Journalists. And they came out with a document called the Diversity Guidelines. In fact, I will just read their opening paragraph to the piece they wrote. On October 6, 2001, at the National Convention in Seattle, the Society of Professional Journalists passed a resolution urging members and fellow journalists to take steps against radical profiling in their coverage of the war on terrorism and to reaffirm their commitment to a series of things. So they're the person who set this narrative. And what did they say? They created rules related to the correct reporting of the story that had nothing to do with reporting the facts of the story. In fact, they established the narrative on which the war was to be reported. So, for example, let me give you a couple of these examples, right from their discussion. Seek out experts on military strategies, public safety, diplomacy, economic, and other pertinent topics who run the spectrum of race, class, gender, and geography. Well, why would that be important? Why wouldn't it be important just to get the experts who are experts? And then they said, cover your coverage of the war on terror against the 5 Maynard Institutes of Journalism and Education fault lines. What were the Maynard Institute guidelines? Well, this was the give. The fault lines are based on cultural diversity and work training in a workplace. So what is the diversity guidelines argued by the Society of Professional Journalism? They were demanding that all reporting of the war on terror be subordinated to what? Subordinated to a multicultural narrative that demanded that we could do anything we want in discussing the war on terror, so long as it had nothing to do with discussing the enemy in fact. The enemy who says, I am a jihadi, I fight jihad according to Islamic law to implement Islamic law. So that was a decision to subordinate the truth of the story as determined by the facts of the matter to an ideologically driven agenda. So a couple other examples of what to do in the stories. Cover the victims of harassment, murder, and other hate crimes as thoroughly as you cover the victims of overt terrorist attacks. Well, of course, if there's a story about murders and other hate crimes, you cover them, and you cover them to the fullness of your story. But why would you have to include that in any discussion of terrorism? In fact, we see another tell that has dominated discussion on the war on terror. Remember, these guidelines were established in October 2001. When writing about terrorism, remember to include white supremacists, radical anti-abortionists, and other groups with a history of such activity. Well, I'm all for going and covering thoroughly skinheads when we're talking about skinheads and what they did. But when I'm reading about skinheads and what they did because they did something somewhere, I don't need to have that colored by what the Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda are doing. So what did they say? Another pointer they had, avoid using terms such as jihad unless you are certain of the precise meaning and include the context when they are used in quotations. So here, we're asking for a really heavy-handed treatment of how the terms are used, where the definition, they would argue, would be one that neutralized what it means. And in fact, our definition goes on and does exactly that. Finally, ask men and women from within the targeted communities to review your coverage and make suggestions. Why is this important? Because as you go on to the SPJ's discussion on diversity, using diversity guidelines on how to report the war on terror, it becomes very clear that the men and women from the targeted areas that they relied on were heavily oriented to the Muslim Brotherhood in America. So Here it is, you're a news organization writing a story about the war on terror. You're not allowed to validate Al-Qaeda's threat doctrine, and you're not allowed to use words like jihad, and you're supposed to go to the targeted community. In this case, the SPJ suggested you go to groups that ended up being key leaders in the Muslim Brotherhood. So I like to point this out because what we have, this is establishing prior restraint. That's a First Amendment consideration. You're going to censor yourself when you go forward and report the news. I think this is very interesting because as we see, as the CVE started to evolve 9 years later, they adopted all of these standards. And in fact, the CVE, adopted by the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, institutionalized this multicultural narrative, which subordinates the facts on the ground, the facts of the enemy, to the multicultural narrative that demands it not be discussed at all. And as I end this, please support the Glazov gang and JamieGlazov.com, and make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Take care.